Thank you all for coming this evening. We're really grateful for you for showing up today. I'm Joseph Capizzi, the Executive Director of the Institute for Human Ecology here at Catholic University. We are the nation's leading institute that focuses on the conditions that conduce to human flourishing. We do this from an interdisciplinary perspective, bringing faculty from across the university, the country, and increasingly from across the globe here to Catholic University to think about these kinds of questions and issues that pertain to all of us. One of our longstanding friendships now has been with Ross Douthat, the opinion writer at the New York Times, the leading Catholic, I think, opinion writer in the country and one of the leading Catholic intellectuals. Ross has been generous with us for 5 years now. Is it 5 years? Yeah, 5 years of friendship and really his giving to us by coming down here away from his family to spend time with us. He puts together these topics. He brings in talented people like you see before you tonight. So we're deeply, deeply grateful. I will turn things over to him in just a moment, and he will introduce the panelists. I'm just going to remind you that the way we do this is Ross and the panelists will have a conversation. They'll then take questions from you guys. Questions will be brief, direct, and insightful. We have microphones that will go around and find you when Ross identifies you as somebody that we want to hear from. I usually give them a signal, like, to avoid that person. And then after that, we'll have a little reception. So do stay for the reception. Again, thank you very much, and thank you, Ross.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Joe for that incredibly kind introduction. I apologize for the, somewhat scattered shushing followed by huddling. I unfortunately had to answer a series of increasingly desperate emails from my beloved wife, who I indeed left alone today because they've the contractors who are building us, a dormer on our attic chose this lovely day to tear the roof off our house. So that's going fine. But if you see a trickle of sweat beating its way down my forehead, know that I'm not merely concerned about the encroachment of euthanasia and the culture of death upon the West, but also about, flying shingles and so on. But we are, in fact, not going to talk about construction projects. We are going to talk about the advance of euthanasia in the Western world. We're going to pay particular attention, I think, to the Canadian experience, which is sort of the impetus for this panel, which I think has actually changed the landscape of the euthanasia debate in various ways that we'll get into in the discussion. But I have a crack team here to discuss these issues with you and introducing them from extreme right to extreme left, appropriately enough. I'm joined by Leah Libresco Sargent, who is, among many other impressive accomplishments, the presiding editor of Other Feminisms, a Substack devoted to, as the title suggests, sort of thinking about, what was the perfect formulation that you offered to me?
The dignity of dependence.
Thank you, the dignity of dependence. And next to her is Ari Schulman, who edits the New Atlantis, which I would describe as the leading intellectual journal in America focused on science, technology, and the human person, and I'm sure you would describe it that way as well.
Yeah, without the little qualification at the end, but otherwise exactly right.
Yes. And finally, Charles Camosy, who is a distinguished professor at the Creighton Medical School and St. Joseph Seminary, the author of multiple books, a long time I'd say deep thinker on issues related to Catholic social teaching and the sort of bioethics and the culture of life. So what we're going to try and do, because while euthanasia gets a certain amount of attention, I think it's not, unlike certain other hot button issues, it's not something that's sort of, debated hotly all the time in your social media feed and so on. So I'm going to ask our panelists to try and give us a certain kind of a backgrounder on the arc of the euthanasia debate over the last quarter century in the United States, Western Europe, North America generally, and then sort of zero in on the sort of specifics of policy, the Catholic and Christian response, and so on. So I told Charles that I'd ask him to go first and see if you tell us about in a sense, sort of the development of assisted suicide and euthanasia as sort of a feature of Western policy since, well, you can begin the story anywhere you like, as long as you don't go for more than 6 minutes and 22 seconds.
Thank you for the invitation, and thanks to the panelists. I'm really excited to be part of the conversation because, full disclosure, we were told about the first question would be asked. I took some notes. I hope you don't mind. A sweeping history of how euthanasia done this is a pretty big row to hoe here, but I'm going to try to keep it to 7 minutes and 22 seconds. I think I do want to start a little bit earlier. If you think about the Christian response to the exposure of infants in the ancient world, I think that really is a kind of marker that kind of shows how Christianity has and should respond to the culture of death, to a throwaway culture in a stark way. I mean, there was the kind of Hippocratic school that pushed back against euthanasia in a particular way, but it was by no means sweeping. And I think we can just honestly say that we need to skip ahead to the Third Reich, actually, from then to the next time in the Western world that we have something like a systematic kind of approach to a throwaway culture and culture of death when it comes to these things. Although we had a lovely coffee before this at Leah's house, we were discussing some of this history. I do want to say that even before the Third Reich, there was this sense, especially during the Great Depression, that there was movement on this question in kind of a growing secularized, or even then maybe post-Christian elite culture with regard to these questions. But the Third Reich kind of pushed, maybe artificially, in a particular direction that the 80s actually really, it took to the 80s to really kind of recover from in terms of the sweep that was going on at the time. The Hemlock Society was founded in the 1980s, now known as Compassion and Choices. They had a PR person really help them out with that one. Serious debates happened in the 80s with the American Medical Association. That led to more significant changes in the 90s. Some of you may remember June 4th, 1990 is when Jack Kevorkian first actively kills a patient. November 1994, the Death with Dignity Act is passed in Oregon, not accidentally one of the most secular and white states in the country. We can talk about the racial justice aspect of this, I hope. But there's also a backlash in the 90s, which I think is worth exploring as well. The Supreme Court rules that there is no right to die in the 1990s. President Bill Clinton forbids using federal funds for physician-assisted killing in the 1990s. California Death with Dignity referendum defeated 46-54. Michigan referendum fails 29-71. So that's not bad as a response in the 90s. But things really start getting bad towards the end of the 90s and the aughts. So 1998, Switzerland sees the formation of Dignitas, who you may know provides so-called assisted suicide tourism from around the world. 2001 is when the Netherlands formally legalizes euthanasia, although the courts there looked the other way for many years since the 80s. They were followed closely by Belgium in 2002. 2004, there's the formation of the Dutch Groningen Protocol, who you may have heard is the euthanasia formal protocol for the euthanasia of newborn infants who, quote, face hopeless and unbearable suffering, end quote. 2008, Washington State legalizes physician-assisted killing. 2008, 2009, Montana courts make it essentially legal. 2012, some good news, an astonishing loss for assisted killing in Massachusetts. Maybe you remember that situation. This was an astonishing turnaround. In late May of that year, the referendum was supported 60-29 in polls. It ended up losing 49-51 from May to November. Just an astonishing turnaround. Is this going on too long, or is this helpful?
No, it's very helpful.
2013.
I'll cut you off.
Okay. 2013, Vermont legalizes physician-assisted killing. Also in 2014, Belgium legalizes euthanasia for terminally and incurably ill children who can consent. 2015, we're starting to get closer to our current time. California becomes the 5th state to legalize physician-assisted killing. But in 2015, we also had more good news. The United Kingdom House of Commons overwhelmingly rejected physician-assisted killing, 330 to 118. 2016, physician-assisted killing becomes legal in Canada. 2017, I'm picking and choosing various things. I hope these are relevant. 2017, the district becomes the 7th US jurisdiction to make it legal. 2017, Victoria, Australia legalizes it. 2017, 9 United States State medical associations drop opposition to physician-assisted killing. 2018, Hawaii falls. 2019, New Jersey and Maine fall. 2020, Germany overturns their ban on organized assisted suicide, at least as long as it's done in altruistic terms, not business terms, whatever that means. 2020, New Zealand falls. 2021, non-terminal patients legally killed in Colombia. First one was an ALS, person with ALS. 2021, Spain falls. 2022, Oregon ends residency requirement, opening itself up to its being its own dignitas in terms of tourism. So there is this slippery slope I hope you see here, not just in terms of legalization, but in various ways I wasn't able to articulate fully, but you might have seen in some of the examples, from accepting assisted suicide to accepting euthanasia, from euthanasia for terminally ill patients to euthanasia for chronically ill individuals, from euthanasia for physical illness, for those for psychological distress, and from voluntary euthanasia to the practice and conditional acceptance of non-voluntary and involuntary euthanasia. Again, we've probably heard this argument many times before. Once you permit it, it's very difficult to keep it where it originally was intended, because medically, legally, and morally it seems unjust to limit it to the particular population for which it was intended. And we've seen, particularly in Belgium, the move from just competent adults to now in Belgium, any child of any age can be killed via physician-assisted killing. Okay, let me finish. And the slippery slope from those who are intended for those who are imminently dying to those who are not is not just limited to those two countries. We're going to hear a lot about Canada in a moment, but I was just researching Italy recently about this. They had their laws against this fall very recently, and the first person to die by physician-assisted killing was this past June, and the victim was a 44-year-old man who was not dying but was paralyzed in a car accident. He was granted physician-assisted suicide. So to call this medical aid in dying is just totally ridiculous, unless by dying you just mean assisted killing, which is what we should call it. That's pretty depressing. Let me finish by offering some maybe hopeful remarks. So we've seen that especially disability rights-led advocacy has been extremely effective in, I think, pushing against this. It was effective in Massachusetts in 2012, like I mentioned, very effective in the UK in 2015. It's remained effective in deep blue states like New York, Connecticut, Maryland, Rhode Island, and more, which continue to hold the line. Legislation, I think it's fair to say, in deep blue Minnesota was recently killed. That's great news. Overall, only 8 states and the District of Columbia have legalized it. I think that's a hopeful thing all by itself. And just as we have seen, and we'll talk more about this, some slippage in regulation and oversight in places like Oregon and California and some of these other states, we haven't seen a formal slide like we've seen in Belgium and the Netherlands and a few other places. Though I'll finish with this point, it's not all happy that it's been this way. Compassionate Choices, again, the former Hemlock Society, has intentionally kept their powder dry when it comes to expanding assisted suicide because they're working so hard in places like Oregon and Connecticut, and they don't want to be able to point to other states that have this slippery slope going on. So by way of example, Oregon tried to move their 6-month threshold to 12 months, and it failed in part because Compassionate Choices came out against it and lobbied against it because they don't want to see. But it has nothing to do with anything logical. There's nothing logical about the stop of the slope. It's just an intention. In part, it's an intentional strategy of our opponents on this to keep it from something we can use as a rhetorical tool. Sorry, that was probably too long, but
No, that was perfect to the second, in fact. So I think that's a good overview of, but I think you captured both, on the one hand, the sort of steady expansion of these kind of laws over the last 20 or 30 years, but also the extent to which, it's a little bit more sort of almost haphazard seeming in certain ways than the big shifts you've seen on other social issues. The fact that you only have, 8 or 9 US states at this point when the country has become more socially liberal in so many respects is, I think, notable. And notwithstanding the examples of Colombia and Italy, it is a kind of, it has the feel still of a kind of Northern European very white American phenomenon, which connects us to our next subject, which is the Canadian experience, which, you may have noticed Canada on that longer list, but the Canadian experience has been notable for its scale, its breadth, and its impact. And R8, the New Atlantis, has run some of the best journalism, I think, anywhere on, the sort of what we've learned from the Canadian experience. So can you talk about that? What have we learned from the Canadian experience?
Unfortunately, I can. Thanks very much, first of all, for inviting me. I should preface this by saying I'm here representing the work that I've published and helped produce more so than my own work. We've published several, I think, very good and important pieces on this recently, especially by a very enterprising and incredibly talented young reporter named Alexander Raikin. Leah's nodding because she interviewed him recently.
The pieces are great.
Yeah. He's just done phenomenal work on this. So the piece that we published recently, it's in our winter issue, which is on the tables on either side. Please pick up a copy if you haven't already. It's called No Other Options. And we were trying to, when working with him, we were trying to accomplish a couple of things with it. First of all, we were looking really just at the Canadian context and not too much trying to compare it to the rest of the world, although we did that a little bit. The reason we focused on Canada is if you're arguing about this in a philosophy classroom, you very quickly get to talking about a slippery slope. When you look at the real world experience, if you're already inclined to believe that argument, you can find justification for it, no matter where you look, especially in the Netherlands. But there are slippery slopes, and then there are slippery slopes. And Canada is an incredible slippery slope. So the one point of comparison that is useful is Canada and California both legalized assisted suicide in 2016. And they both have about the same population, a little less than 40 million people. In the last year for which there's data, 2021, there were about 500 people who received assisted suicide in California. In Canada, that number was 10,000. So 20 times more. It's grown 20 times faster in Canada than in California. I don't know in great detail about the California legal regime, but just based on what we know about California, we wouldn't think that would be a state that would exercise an enormous amount of restraint. But somehow in Canada, they've managed to do it much more efficiently. So we were trying to understand, how has that happened? How has it arrived at that scale? And we were also trying to speak to readers who did not necessarily come to this subject completely opposed in all circumstances to assisted suicide. Somebody who might be sympathetic to it, to the plight of somebody who is in extreme suffering and wants to have the right to end their suffering, but is also sensitive to the possibility of abuse. That was the core reader we were really trying to reach. And we were talking about this internally. We had a lot of meetings about the material we were working through and how to make sense of it. First of all, just to ourselves about what we were looking at, because a lot of the material that was being reported in this piece, I had trouble believing it myself, even being something of a cynic. And one of the images that we came up with, we were talking about how if you are open to the possibility of assisted suicide, you have in mind something like this character that Richard Dreyfuss plays in this movie from the early 1980s. Whose right is it anyway? Something like that. He plays this character who is paralyzed from the neck down. He's extremely sharp in mind. He isn't depressed. He isn't suffering from any mental conditions other than he can't have the quality of life that he wants anymore. He wants his physician to euthanize him. And there's a kind of legal drama, a morality play where he goes through the court to fight for this right. I think that's the person that people have in mind when they're sympathetic to assisted suicide. And then on the other side, the other dynamic that's at work here is how do you distinguish that person from somebody who is just suicidal in what we consider an ordinary way, somebody who is in despair. Because one of the interesting features that you find in Canada is at the same time that assisted suicide has been rising, there's also been a parallel increase in the rise in therapeutic culture, a rising awareness of mental health, a rising awareness of suicidal ideation and prevention. I think just this month or within the last month or two, Canada took online a national 3-digit suicide hotline. This has happened in the United States as well. It's not very well known yet, but there is a national suicide awareness hotline. I can't even remember the number offhand, but it's supposed to be equivalent to 911. But they've been doing this in Canada at the same time. And so one of the questions that presents itself is when somebody shows up to a medical professional or a mental health professional how do you distinguish between these two people? Because you're essentially supposed to recognize one person and tell them, you're wrong, in essence, your life is worth living. And another person you're supposed to say, this choice is the right one and we're gonna help you carry it out. And one way to ask what's happening in Canada is to say, is this a system that is successfully able to distinguish between these two cases? And the answer is a really resounding no. The first way that you can see that is just by the sheer scale of the number of people who are being killed. Another way you can see that is if you look at the approval numbers. You have to go through an approval process. If you read about this on paper, it sounds nice and legalistic and kind of liberal and procedural and sounds like a reasonable set of safeguards if you're going to have a system like this. Well, the reality is only 4% of people in the last year were denied their applications for assisted suicide in Canada. And one of the things that this report shows is if you are denied, there is an organization that will help you doctor shop until you get an approval. If you're denied, that's not a final denial. That only means that that one person, that one application was denied. You can reapprove, you can find somebody else to do it. And there's an organization that will help you do it. That organization is also the organization that has had the task of regulating euthanasia providers outsourced to by the Canadian government. So the government itself doesn't train euthanasia providers. It outsources it to this organization that is avowedly and very openly pro-euthanasia. There's a whole lot of details like this that I can get into, but what you essentially see is a system that is designed to give everybody involved. It's almost like if you watch like The Sopranos, you hear Tony Soprano's talking to his lawyer, and the lawyer stops him and says, "I don't need to hear anything else. You take it from here. You understand what to do." You have a system that is sort of set up in that way, except almost everybody involved in the system, it's designed to insulate themselves as well from fully understanding or taking accountability for what it is that they're doing. So this was, again, one of the questions we had is there have been cases in the past of government-led, very concerted efforts to essentially eliminate the weak. And we were wondering, is that what we're seeing in Canada? I think it largely isn't. I think what you largely see is something that's more like the banality of evil sort of argument. Obviously, those overlap a little bit. But it is this very bureaucratic language. When you listen to the people who are carrying this out, they are speaking do-gooder language. They sound very, very soft-hearted and earnest. They don't sound like villains who are scheming to systematically eliminate the weak. And yet that's what they're doing. And they're doing it really with full awareness of what they're doing. They're confronted with this reality all the time. Our reporter, Sasha, confronted them with this reality in the course of doing this reporting. We did it ourselves in doing the fact-checking and talking to them and asking us, is there anything wrong in what we're reporting? And so that is it's less shocking in a sense because you don't have too many villains in the story, too many evil schemers. There are a few of them. You see one or two of these characters show up who have clearly gone past the feel-good stage and just really love death and love doing euthanasia. There's one or two of those characters in the story. But most of them are more just kind of earnest types. So it's a little less shocking, yet it should be, I think, much more frightening because it's much easier to imagine how people can walk into doing that without ever fully having to understand that they are holding evil in their hearts. It's very frightening, I believe.
What's the share of Canadian deaths now?
So they're a little behind on their reporting. The last year for which there's full reporting is 2021, and it was 3.3% of people who died in Canada in 2021 died from assisted suicide, and that was up from 0 about 5 years before that. And if you look at the chart, it's almost like a graphical illustration of the slippery slope. It's amazing how fast it's going up. It was 10,000 deaths in 2021. If you just carry that line out, I would bet that it's probably 15,000 last year, could be 16, 18, 20,000 this year, with no clear sign of where it will plateau.
Yeah. So this is not a diverse panel in the sense that I have, not put you guys together with someone who is fully committed to the wisdom and justice of euthanasia. But as the moderator for Leah, I'll sort of set out and say, okay, obviously there are problems in these kinds of systems, right? But what is the actual alternative here, right? That we're, one of the arguments that sort of came up even in the aftermath of the reporting that the New Atlantis did was basically the argument that, look, the Western world is an aging society that errs intensely on the side of sort of over-treatment and unnecessary life extension of the old. And if there are some people who wish to be removed from that experience, then, and it's only 2% or only 3% of all deaths, right? Yeah, there were people who made arguments like that. Why would you not sort of accept this as just part of life in a free society? And then connected to that, what is sort of the alternative mode of care? You can't be, have your society held hostage by people demanding infinite medical care and saying, I want to kill myself if all of my needs aren't met, and so on. So can you talk a little bit about sort of an alternative vision?
Absolutely. And I think a large part of answering, the push towards euthanasia is developing an alternate model of how we die, because we're not fighting for the status quo before euthanasia. Plenty of people who have experience with, our current method of dying, that infinite extension, keeping people on machines for a long time. They know that's not how they want to die. Doctors who work in palliative care write advance directives that aren't for euthanasia, but are for, please not what happens for my patients, right? And they see it close up. I think often the challenge for Catholics when we kind of come up against an error in the culture is that our no is heard much more loudly than our yes. We say no to euthanasia, and people aren't quite sure what we're saying yes to in terms of how we die and how we prepare to die. We say no to forms of marriage that aren't marriage in a culture that doesn't know what a strong yes to marriage looks like. And so I actually want to ask a little bit in this room, how much people have ever seen that yes. So just for folks in the room and live stream folks, you can raise your hands too, but I won't be able to incorporate them into my tallies. I wanted to ask, how many people have been to a funeral with an open casket? That's a lot in this room, and not for me. All right, how many people have been at the bedside of someone who is actively dying? All right, that's still a lot, and not me. But I think in the broader culture, there's a retreat from death. And so you wind up in a culture where kind of death is a little abstract. People may not have seen it before, including not until their parents are getting ready to die. And then kind of kids wind up with the job of helping their parents die well as their first death that they face, which is very hard. You want more experience of seeing people help others through death before you're called to do that for someone you love who depends particularly on you. And I think it's hard in a culture where people don't have good experiences of death or even a sense of what the goal is in dying well, that isn't just minimizing suffering, to articulate what it is we want to do for each other. And in the absence of that model, we kind of have the secular model of what a good life looks like, which really turns on two things: control and expressive individualism, where a good experience of life is something that you can manage yourself, can script and judge how well it goes based on how well it follows that script, which is not how dying goes. So it sets people up immediately for a certain kind of disappointment. And then we have the second part, which is that your life should be expressive. Everything in your life should indicate you, should be kind of self-chosen. You should author yourself moment to moment. And again, that puts too much pressure on death. In some ways, of course, death is the most personal and intimate thing we do, and you can't die except as yourself. But to make it a work of art, to take it in the way the Canadians have sometimes done, where you'll have these ad campaigns for assisted suicide. The woman who was preparing to die, who, after she was dead, her friends talked about how it wasn't that she was embracing death, it was that she felt like other doors were closed to her. But a mall, Simon's Mall, had this ad campaign celebrating her choice to kill herself and celebrating how it was an expression of who she was. I think we see a lot of really poisonous choices put in front of people with this idea of, unless it's chosen, unless it's individual, unless it's expressive, it's not real and it's not good. And there's nothing good about submitting to just reality as it is. I think that's the challenge in articulating what it can look like to die well, even in a secular context, without the full context of to die in friendship with Christ, which is ultimately what we're playing for. It can be hard if people have never seen it done well. And so I want to talk a little about one example, which is from the Dominican Cisterns of Hawthorne. They're in Hawthorne, New York. They have vocations events coming up in the spring for any young women who are in the audience, which you can join by Zoom. And their vocation is taking care of poor people who are dying of cancer, who are terminally ill. Exactly the people who are perfect candidates for euthanasia in most euthanasia regimes. They're poor, they don't have other support, they're definitely dying, and their deaths are not anticipated to be easy or pleasant. And the sisters don't have a fix for that. One of the sisters, when I interviewed her for Plow, said she was nervous because she didn't have a medical background. She was being trained as a nurse as part of living out this vocation. She was nervous because she hasn't done this before. She's learning to practice medicine to an extent. And someone said, well, the good news is they're going to die. You're not being called on to save these people. You're being called on to care for them. And that's a different way of approaching the work. But when people come, when their families bring them to the sisters, often the family members are really intent on trying to prove to the sisters that their family member is worthwhile. They'll say, you don't know him, but he used to play basketball. He used to do this. She used to do the crossword every day. And they kind of stack up these past accomplishments and interests to prove, used to doing this for doctor after doctor, that the person they love is a person. Maybe they don't look like one right now, but believe me, they were a person very recently. Please treat them like a person now. And the sisters don't care. They're happy to hear these things, but their job is to love each person they meet as they are. And for them, it's less painful. They don't see a diminution. They just see a son or daughter of God, lovable completely as they are, with whatever debilities they suffer and whatever pain they are, with whatever they've lost. And they say, I'm here to love this person. I don't need it to be proved to me that they're lovable. I don't need a list of their resume to prove that they're lovable, but they see family members who have desperately tried to prove that to doctor after doctor. They needed some kind of evidence that this was a person, who needed proof of their recent personhood to treat them like a person now. And when I see the sisters, I really see a model of how I want to approach my own death one day and how I want to approach death for people I love, which is, the challenge is, if you commit to love a person for their whole life, this is what their whole life looks like. It's just like Newhouse, in his talking about our fight against abortion, says, the justification isn't that a baby in the womb looks like a person, they're almost person-like, but that, a baby, even at the stage when they've got kind of flippers instead of fingers, looks like a person because that's what a person who's that age looks like. Someone who's dying looks like a person because that's what someone who's dying looks like. And it takes kind of repeated experience with that, of love, of giving and receiving it, to trust that we can be loved even when we don't look like our very narrow model of a full human life.
So that was lovely, Leah. Thank you. Let's talk for a minute about, let's sort of stay on that question for a minute, right? Because I think that, and then I'll try and segue this to a discussion about public opinion and the politics of this issue. But one thing you notice in arguments and debates, right, is that, the Catholic Church has some fairly fine-tuned distinctions about what is and is not suicide, euthanasia, and so on. Even those admit of certain gray areas. But once you get beyond the realm of sort of, official church thinking, I think for a lot of people, it's very uncertain what actually counts as euthanasia. In fact, there was a prominent writer just the other day on Twitter who wrote a kind of soul-bearing confession about their experience sort of taking their own mother off life support when they were a teenager. And, I don't know I had a brief communication with this writer. I don't know all of the details, but it seemed pretty clear to me that this was, in fact, not a case of assisted suicide, that this was a case that, falls under the broad category of making decisions to cease life-sustaining care when that seems appropriate. But this person had lived with this sense of, effectively had thought of themselves as someone who had participated in an assisted suicide for their entire life, which in turn obviously had effects on their views about euthanasia and assisted suicide. I'm curious, for any of you, but maybe start with you, Charles, to what extent is that kind of the challenge of sort of, there's a kind of tacit utilitarianism that a lot of people have, right? Where it's like, whether, if, the outcome is what matters, right? And if the outcome is that they died, then you've participated in some sense in a euthanizing project and so on. And do you think that's right? Do you think that that's sort of part of what shapes sort of public sympathy for euthanasia overall? The sense that like it's all sort of just a continuum and everyone is participating in some sense if they make any decision that hastens death?
Yeah, I think so. I was in preparation for tonight. I was looking at doing some research, and some articles were saying, as part of the history of this, the first time this particular organization said it was okay to remove life support or something as part of the history of assisted suicide euthanasia. Catholic definition of euthanasia is an act or an omission which of itself or by intention causes death. And so that, of course, using the principle of double effect, leaves open a wide range of choices in which death is foreseen but not intended. I like to talk about it as a choice about how to live one's final moments as they're dying, as opposed to a choice that aims at death. I do think your question, though, and I'm so glad you asked it because I would have brought it up if you didn't ask it, is I think there is a real challenge, though, because in the broader culture, there are omissions which aim at death that we don't really quite look at as in the same category for some reason. But a Catholic vision of this does put them in the same category. It's an act or an omission which of itself or by intention causes death. And I think we need to be honest with ourselves. This happens all the time. This happens all the time. We might have small numbers now when it comes to active euthanasia, but omissions which are aiming at death happen all the time. Even in reputable hospices, they sometimes just stop feeding people, right? Because it's time for them to die now. Or if you want to go into a different context, you can play, fancy games with morphine and other drugs, right? Saying, well, we foresee, but don't intend this is going to hasten the result. But in reality, what's going on here in many cases is an attempt to hasten death. Even the language, I've always been disturbed by this. My mom would always use this phrase, and for her it was an old phrase too. Calling pneumonia the old man's friend always kind of disturbed me in this regard.
My mother uses that phrase too.
So I think we need to make space. Obviously, Christ on the cross and the martyrs show that you can for sure act in a way that you foresee but don't intend your death, and that needs to be an essential and is an essential part of Catholic bioethics and moral theology. One of the best arguments actually of our opponents on this is to say we are already aiming at the death of the people all the time by omission. Let's have a heart for these people, right? Let's have a heart for them and actually give them a nice, peaceful kind of send-off into sleep, rather than just stopping feeding them or stop the treatment or stop that whatever. So I think this is a really, really important set of questions, not only for intra-Catholic debates, but for thinking about the broader culture as well.
But I mean, to what extent do you think of that as, there is a sense in which, right, you don't want to live in a society that has an anti-euthanasia regime that sort of effectively tramples on privacy, right, and sort of leaves doctors and nurses and caregivers constantly looking over their shoulders, right, about like, when did I, at what point did I, reduce the morphine drip inappropriately and so on, right? I mean, it seems like part of the case against euthanasia has to be saying, look, in any system, there's going to be a gray area. The point is that it's a mistake. It is that move from this gray area justifies a formalized system is sort of precisely the mistake, it seems to me.
Yeah, I agree with that. But and there are no doubt many cases for sure where public policy might lead a broad array of choices open to people, even if it allows some bad things to happen. But in point of fact, a lot of people point to the Baby Doe case, which some of you may be familiar with as kind of the beginning of contemporary bioethics, which by itself was an example of a choice not to fix esophageal atresia on a baby because they had Down syndrome, right? So it was a refusal to aid, right? It was an omission aiming at the death of a child precisely because of their disability. And so not every case is that clear cut, but that set off, as some of you may know from either study or personal experience, that set off a bipartisan firestorm against this. We reacted so strongly to it. Disability rights and Reaganite bedfellows both reacted so strongly against it, and that was a beautiful moment, actually. But yeah, I take your point that in many circumstances we would have to be pretty nuanced about making space for certain kinds of choices.
I have less of a policy framework and more of an individual discernment framework, which I think one of the easiest ways of understanding the principle of double effect is that in cases where you anticipate death will be the result, right, but you're not aiming at it, you'd be surprised and thrilled if you were able to remedy pain without hastening death. Where again, to kind of translate this back and forth between end of life at the end of life and end of life when it comes near the beginning of life, for a patient who has preeclampsia, who can't sustain her baby very much longer. We don't have a good treatment for it. We can buy a couple days, maybe. And a doctor has to deliver early. At 36 weeks, the doctor delivers early and expects everything will go pretty well for the baby. At 32 weeks, the doctor delivers early to save the mother's life and has very good odds for the baby. At 22 weeks, the doctor delivers early and about 60% of babies survive at that point. And that's a case where I think you see kind of the same action of early delivery that you see in cases that are illicit, right? That are abortive in their intention. And the note is that everyone in the room is rooting for the baby. They know their actions may imperil the baby's life. They know they don't have another way of treating the mother. And everyone in the room is aiming at saving the life of the baby if possible. And I think similarly when it comes to end-of-life choices, that you might have a moment where you have a conversation, go, how are we balancing pain management and death at this point? And there's certainly places where along that spectrum the answer is clear of like, the example of a hospice nurse is like, well, you certainly don't want to give this much. That would be a mistake. People have those conversations. And then you understand that if you gave that much medicine and the hospice nurse came back and found out your parent was alive, they'd be surprised, confused, and disappointed, right? Versus trying to do your best to manage pain, trying to respond to the signs of someone who's stopped eating and drinking with attentiveness to them, and rooting for them to have whatever days they have left and not feeling a sense of relief that you have succeeded in killing them is where I would put kind of the individual attentiveness.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that. I know the question you asked, you can't just say no. How can you say yes is an important one. But I think that learning why you should say no, being able to say no in a robust way can be a step toward that. I know that that's been the case for a lot of people I know, and even for myself personally, and how my own thinking has evolved on this issue. There's a big difference between, again, thinking about it in the freshman philosophy, one set of interests or one set of goods versus another way, versus seeing how it's actually played out. And when you look at these actual stories, you see that that's the thing about withdrawing care, withdrawing food in hospice, because it's kind of time for a person to go. You see that times about 1,000 in a system that is as hungry as the Canadian euthanasia system is. You see it in, there's lots of these reported stories of somebody like a veteran who's paralyzed from the waist down, going into the VA and saying, I would like to get a wheelchair ramp installed in my house. And someone says, okay, are you also interested in talking about medical assistance in dying? You see it throughout the healthcare system, those kinds of conversations are being raised. And the part that is most distressing is that you see it in patients themselves. You see lots of doctors, and especially a lot of healthcare providers, who are saying, I have patients, I've been doing this for 30 years. I know what kinds of disease are out there. I know of a certain type of person. Not everybody can be helped by mental health care, but I know of a type of case where 5 years ago, this person would have had a really good prospect for improvement, and now they're coming to me and saying, I need this way out. And they feel both that it's obligatory upon them, they want this sort of quick answer. I think, Ross, you're asking, you're saying there's a real problem being raised here. There is a way that you can look at the drive for assisted suicide if you wanted to treat it through the framework of maybe this is a very malformed response to a real and genuine insight and problem. I think it is true that maybe there is something there that is better able than the general population that isn't thinking about this to recognize the problem of what is a good death, and are we as a society providing a good death to most people who die, and probably we are not. I think that by engaging with this problem, you can recognize that. But if you read the stories of what's actually happening, you read our report. There was a great piece in the Atlantic about this about 12 years ago called Death Becomes Him, about how this has happened in the Netherlands. If you just read the real world stories and come to them with an open mind, you will see that assisted suicide is not providing people a good death. That very often what is happening when you listen to people who are in the situation is that they are alone, they're afraid, they want somebody to be there with them. I was thinking of this again and again when you were talking about this, Leah. There's a woman who we reported on. It's hard to even describe it here on stage because it was just so heartbreaking reading her story. She was posting videos to YouTube about her situation, chronicling her progress through the assisted suicide progress. And a few days before she received euthanasia, she posted on her YouTube saying, if I could just have somebody here with me. Sometimes when there's another person with me, that feels like that's all I need for the pain to go away. And surely her case was more complicated than that. This was somebody who was not, by the way, terminally ill. She had a form of chronic leukemia, but not a terminal form of leukemia. This was a case of somebody who really should have clearly been supported. Helping people in that sort of situation it's not easy, it's not straightforward, it's not as simple as saying, we say no to this one side. But I think it could spur people to action to look and say, look, if we don't support people, if we don't provide them that material support they need, that emotional and spiritual support they need, this is the alternative. And when you see that commercial, the ad that was made by that department store, the thing that stood out about that for me is that this woman was surrounded by people in this ad. And if you read how she actually died and how most people actually die under euthanasia, they die alone. They're not dying surrounded by calm and comfort. It is a medicalized way to make everybody else feel better about it. It's not really about making the person who's dying feel better.
So let's talk for a minute about, I guess, the sort of, the feeling that at least some people get reading these accounts, but also sort of the general phenomenon of resistance to this. Because, in a way, this is a dark story, but in a way, as we said at the outset, from the point of view of sort of the range of contests that Catholics and religious conservatives are engaged in, you can argue that the battle over euthanasia has, yielded a lot of surprising victories and, a lot of resistance to this. And then if you look at something like the Canadian experience where it happens so rapidly and so sweepingly, you can say, well, how could that happen? But you could also say, well, why didn't that just happen? Because rapid sweeping changes have been a norm on other issues. So from that sort of optimistic spirit, what do you guys think are sort of the centers of resistance, particularly in the U.S., but we can talk beyond the U.S. if you want, to something like the Canadian experience just becoming the Western norm? Charlie, do you want to start?
Yeah, maybe I'll reiterate my point from my opening remarks about disability rights activists as leading the charge here in a way that's just absolutely profound. And for instance, when you have the first person in Italy to legally die by physician-assisted killing be a paraplegic, right? That sends a very clear message and a terrible message about, well, the 18-year-old who just broke up with his girlfriend is depressed. We're not going to let him kill himself. But you got paralyzed in a car accident. We can understand why you would want to kill yourself. You can understand why disability rights communities would be fired up to lead the resistance here. And again, in Massachusetts in 2012, in 2015 in the UK, and in almost every hearing that I've been a part of and that I've heard about that is successful, a disability, a person with, in fact, disabilities is often leading the charge in a way that that is successful. I'll let my distinguished colleague to my right fill in on this, but and we were just talking about this a little bit during coffee as well. I wonder if we can start adding people to testify at these hearings who have been victims in precisely the way that this great story, important story, highlighted. Can we bring somebody who says, I wanted a wheelchair ramp installed in my home, and instead I was offered physician-assisted killing? Could that person speak at the next Connecticut hearing of the Judiciary Committee and say, don't do this, right? And there are innumerable examples that we could use now from Canada to do that. So I guess that's where I'm thinking about trying to move the ball on this.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add to that. One of the things that I've seen, there's been a lot of shifting discussion around this in Canada in the last year in response to a lot of reporting, not just what we've done, but a lot of other places. And one of the responses I've seen just in the last few months is you start seeing pictures of businesses in Canada that are posting signs on their door. These are especially healthcare providers, ERs, family practitioners, and so forth. They're posting signs on their door saying, basically, this is a safe space. If you come here, we will not prompt you about MAID. We will not discuss MAID here. And if you read the language of this, it's clearly lefty inclusive language. And it follows pretty straightforwardly from that language of inclusivity, and especially of protecting the marginalized and the vulnerable. I mean, this is the most materially marginal and vulnerable population that you can imagine, the poor and the disabled. That's a lot of who is getting euthanasia in Canada. I don't know how much farther that's going to go. I think maybe you'd need maybe a clearer villain in that story for it to really blow up into a full national consciousness sort of thing, but stranger things have happened.
I changed my mind about euthanasia. I grew up as an atheist. I became Catholic after college. And I changed my mind about it before I became Catholic, or at least not entirely as the result of becoming Catholic, because I had believed that, euthanasia might remain kind of questionable, but in that range you're talking about, Ross, that range of people are near the end of life. You're kind of in this confusing period of, if I up the morphine, is that the right thing to do? How anxious should I be about doing it? And just a little more formalized. And then in 2015, I think there was a story in the New Yorker about the euthanasia regime in Belgium. And it changed my mind about whether euthanasia was a containable movement. Because it's not the story of kind of families coming together and taking care of people as they die. It's a story of a son who's suing his mother's doctor for euthanizing her without talking to her family, of making this a decision of one individual that happens suddenly in a vulnerable moment. And that the doctor sees that as the right way to approach it, because he sees this as a question of like one person alone, not as someone who has a family, who's connected to others, who have some stake in how they live and how they die. And, I think part of pushing back against this is that question of, people not as lone individuals who can be killed without consequence to others, but as members of a family, of friends, et cetera, and how we kind of articulate those different ways of viewing the world. Because what I see in Canada, and in the really excellent reporting done in the new Atlantis, which you'll find at either end of the room, because it's very good, is that there's this mindset almost of that it's dangerous to wait to deny anyone death. There's that emphasis on helping people doctor shop, that if you're denied somewhere, it must be an illegitimate denial. You know what's best for you. We'll help you find a different doctor. That there shouldn't be waiting periods for very long, that's an injustice.
Yeah.
And, I think part of pushing back against that is really pushing back against this rush towards death, and this sense of medicine as solving the problem of people existing, right? I think in terms of bulwarks in the United States, for better or for worse, hi baby, Americans don't really trust their doctors, which I have some problems with as someone who's interested in public health, though also wants doctors to be more worthy of trust. But I think that actually is a significant bulwark here because, people certainly had the experience during COVID of hearing doctors say, well, let's ration the ventilators and people with intellectual disabilities shouldn't get them if it comes down to it. And they didn't receive those decisions with trust. People see kind of the idea of more making a patient go away than trying to meet them, live with them, like address themselves to their problem in a really in-depth, curious way, rather than trying to find a box to put them in and then put them away, which is something I think you've written very movingly about, Ross, in your memoir of Lyme disease. But I certainly think in kind of the fringier parts of the world you've encountered, you find people who are open to a lot of ideas, but very skeptical that doctors are approaching medicine from a position of real care. And I think for that reason, Americans are less comfortable with the idea of your doctor coming to your house to kill you. Because I think people have the experience.
Here's to that.
Yeah. I think it's relatively easy to imagine a world in which a doctor, doesn't listen to your Lyme symptoms as a question of how to ameliorate them, but does say, well, should you go, right? Like, I don't want to deal with this complicated, messy disease, but I have a very pat solution for it. I think people encounter that kind of in the fringier, more contested parts of medicine. And it's a reason why folks who live there, who are dismissed by doctors, don't have a high degree of trust for doctors who are like, actually, you can come back. I have one thing I can do for you.
tell me if you guys think this is right. I mean, one, you mentioned the sort of, the language of social justice and inclusivity showing up in skepticism about euthanasia in Canada. I mean, one thing that it's always seemed to me, there are a bunch of culture war debates in this country where the liberal intelligentsia has been a kind of vanguard that has sort of brought the mass of public opinion, or at least sort of lefty and center-left public opinion, along with it. I think you can certainly tell that story about same-sex marriage. You could tell it about other issues as well. On euthanasia, in my experience, there's sort of more public support for it, depending on how you word it, in polls, than there is an impulse towards it among, the kind of people who write for liberal political magazines, let's say, right? There's more anxiety about it at, places like the New Republic or the Atlantic than there is about other social issues. And I'm curious if one of you guys agree with that, and two, that seems to be sort of contraindicated by the Canadian experience, where it seemed like, until this really got going, there seemed to be almost no opposition to it at all, right? It just seemed to be sort of taken, again, among the sort of, liberal Mandarin class, right? That like, this was fine, this was going to be great. And any skepticism or doubt came in much more belatedly. So are our liberals just better than their liberals? Is there this sort of conflictedness that I see? Do you think that's right?
I think there's a possible tipping point where if it becomes a polarized issue, everyone will find their side and stick to it very hard, right? Like, and the fact that it isn't polarized now helps keep people really in that feeling of, well, I don't want to stand in people's way if they're suffering, but I really don't feel comfortable with it. But I'd kind of contrast it with the safe, legal, and rare approach to abortion on the left, where people openly said every abortion is a bad thing in some sense. I'm not endorsing abortion, but in some cases it might be necessary, which I feel is more like that torn feeling we see on euthanasia. But after enough polarization, people all flipped very strongly to actually, it's a good thing. It's a celebration, have a party. And I worry that, I don't know where that point is, but there'd be a point at which if euthanasia became a left versus right issue, people would slip very quickly to like taking their side as hard as they possibly could.
Yeah, it's strange. The politics of it feels more muddled to me now than it did, say, 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. If you think about the political landscape of the 1990s, I think it was a very straightforward, in my view, I was a little young at the time, but it was a pretty straightforward left versus right issue. It may not have had a huge amount of salience for a lot of people, but that was the mapping. It's a little hard to figure out where it comes down now. When you think about classical understandings of liberalism, one of the things that the left has always been able to do well is to understand the limits of, this is a sort of the left critiquing the left, but the limits of atomized and thought about freedom and about liberalism, right? The ways that people can have their freedom limited in informal ways by social pressure and social expectations. There are ways that you find that critique having become much sharper and more acute on the left than it once was, and there are other ways that they seem to be sort of totally blind to it. Just to spell this out a little bit, if you want to become skeptical of libertarianism, reading about the way euthanasia is actually implemented is a great way to go about doing that, because you see that the kind of sense of a sovereign choice happening, it really breaks down when people are in their most vulnerable and needy moments. And you can see this when I read these stories. I feel a sense of injustice on behalf of the people, most especially of the people who feel an expectation upon themselves to die, that they feel that others are expecting of it, whether it's society, whether it's their families. And I see that sort of reaction happening as well. Sometimes the other way around, you'll have people applying for euthanasia over the objection of their family members. We have one, there's a video in this story. If you look at the story on the website, there's a clip of this woman, this euthanasia provider who's provided several hundred assisted suicides, talking about how angry family members are the greatest risk of euthanasia providers. And she laughs while she's saying this. That is powerful in my view. And I think that that's powerful to a lot of people because I think that it has the possibility to reshape where people's sympathies come down. If you are sympathetic to assisted suicide from a liberal point of view, it's because you imagine the injustice of somebody being denied their choice. And often you may imagine a specific person, a mean government, maybe a kind of stern father figure in charge of government, fill in whichever mean right-wing politician you want to, who's denying somebody this right. When you read about the way that it actually happens, possibly the villain is not as clear, but the sense of the injustice flips around. And the instinct that I think it's possible to have, and that again I know I've had and a lot of other people have had, is this is a case where you want to step in and say, we're not going to let you do that, right? It's the friend who walks up to the edge of the cliff. They're tinkering around, they're having fun. You say, okay, have fun. Once they walk up to the edge, that's the point that you step in and say, sorry, we're overriding your choice. There are resources from within a lot of different ideologies and points of view for recognizing that. And they are there on the left too. I think they're fairly latent right now, but they're a little bit more active now than they were 10 or 20 years ago in certain ways. So it's possible to see that coming to the fore more.
We're going to turn to questions, but before that, I just wanted Charlie to weigh in on this, because you've probably spent the most time sort of engaged with the social justice left, the racial justice left. You talked about disability rights earlier. Like, where do you think not the liberal mandarins, but the sort of activist left in America is on euthanasia now? Divided, sort of. What's your sense?
Yeah, divided. I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. I like to think about the fact, in trying to think about this, like where we're going and where, in light of where we've been. It's interesting to me that it was deeply white Oregon, deeply white Washington, deeply white Montana, which kind of was the beachhead for physician-assisted killing in the United States. And it's also interesting that it's deep blue northeastern states which have put up some of the strongest fights against this. My own home state of New Jersey recently capitulated, but put up a fight for a long time. Massachusetts, we already talked about. New York, Connecticut. So these are really interesting developments, and I don't think we can disconnect it from racial justice. I think that's perhaps a difference between the left in Canada and the left in the United States, if in fact the left in the United States are taking voices of color seriously on this question. And I think that's an open question. But if in fact they are, that would help explain some of this, because the classic person who opposes euthanasia is a black vulnerable person. That's a classic example of somebody who opposes it way more than, say, in comparison, a privileged white person. And so if in fact liberal activists, progressive activists are interested in listening to these voices, privileging these voices, then it is going to make it more complicated for them by definition. And that's another thing I think that we need to really focus on as a pro-life movement more broadly, but especially when it comes to these issues, is amplifying these particular voices of color.
All right, let's go to Q&A. I'm just going to ask you to raise your hands, and one hand at a time, I guess, and let's go. Sorry. Yeah, and the mic will come. There you go.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Jackie Kane. I'm a PhD student at the John Paul II Institute right across the street. And I was just wondering, actually, Mr. Schulman, you mentioned something offhandedly about finding a villain. And I was wondering, does anyone know, like, it seems like there's it's a groundswell of sort of personal individual support, right, for the right to die. But are there corporations supporting this, funding these movements? And also particularly I was interested if people know much about the interests of the medical insurers and the hospitals in reducing costs and supporting euthanasia. Thank you.
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly. There isn't the quite smoking gun evidence of somebody at an insurance company saying this is going to help keep our bills down, but there's something pretty close to that in that there are Canadian researchers who have documented that MAID is going to help save the public health system money. Now, they didn't go on and then say, and that's a good thing. You don't have to read too hard between the lines to understand that. So it may be one of those things, like a lot else that's happening in the system, where it proceeds and is helped along by that understanding without there necessarily having to be an explicit discussion along those lines. Although I wouldn't be shocked if those discussions are happening somewhere that hasn't been discovered yet.
Charlie, who are besides Compassion in Dying and sort of the overt activist groups, Are there sort of hubs in the world of foundations and public interest groups that are big supporters of, the push in New Jersey or the push anywhere else?
Yeah, I've not done research into this. I can't speak to it as clearly as I would like. I do think there is a kind of adjacent set of concerns. Perhaps some of you have heard of quality adjusted life years as a metric for thinking about how to allocate scarce resources. There's good reason to be skeptical of CVS Caremark today for lots of reasons related to the abortion pill, not least. But as part of my research into writing a recent column on them, I discovered that CVS Caremark now employs quality adjusted life years as part of their the way that they will distribute drugs to folks at the end of life. So explicitly using ableist reasoning, very adjacent to the kind of reasoning that is used to do this. So that's not answering the question you asked me, but it's maybe relevant in this context too.
And I'll just say your time is never wasted in fighting insurance companies, just because they operate from a model of our goal is to throw up barriers to people seeking real care in the hopes many of them will go away and we don't have to provide it. And most recently, ProPublica had a feature on Cigna, which just technically has to have doctors review denials of coverage for care, but they send them to them in batches of hundreds. They don't have to open them, and they just have to click a button that says approve. And that's their process, right? And that's a process that sees patients as a problem, and their goal is to make them go away.
My question's coming as a priest and as a pastor. It's on the intergenerational question. So we have the Carmelite sister, the agent affirmed, and I've been in a lot of hospital rooms. People have died. And one of the things the sisters have taught me through the years is people come, drop their family members, usually the elderly, off. I provided good care to mom and dad. Now I can just go and live my life. And my question is, and it's been hinted at a bit, but to make it maybe more concrete for my own mind, the intergenerational reality, and how is this issue of euthanasia something arising maybe out of an intergenerational relationship breakdown? There might even be a issue of culture in there too.
I think that's absolutely the case. And we see it as a species of a broader problem with regard to intergenerational connection, right? People aren't having babies, right? That's a major part of this. And those that are, like myself, move across the country away from their parents. And we also have these, like you mentioned, the kind of throwaway culture, which says, I've done my due diligence, it's time to just push them off into a particular kind of home. I think a huge part of what Leah was talking about in terms of being around good deaths comes from making structures, putting structures in place that allow for that. And what you just described is a structure of sin, right? A very much a structure of our throwaway culture. As the Holy Father mentioned, we multiple times, we need a counterculture of encounter and hospitality to resist throwaway culture. And the church can do this in a dramatic way. We run a lot of nursing homes, right? We run a lot of care homes. We can even be very creative in our own institutions, trying to think about ways that we could have intergenerational contact across difference. I have fantasies about building institutions where the local Catholic school interacts with people being cared for in the convent that's been created, turned into a care home, right, for the aged, and thinking about those kind of spaces of intergenerational encounter and hospitality. And one more thing, can we please find a way, this is DC, right? Can we find a way to reimburse for in-home care? Is that something we can kind of get done? This is a no-brainer, in part because it's so much cheaper to reimburse for in-home care than it is for institutional care, but also just because it is part of what it means to be pro-family and to create these encounters that are so important.
Yeah, I think it's harder for a family to kind of shoulder these burdens the smaller the family is, because it's much harder to do this yourself alone than to have a few siblings and you're kind of trading things off. There's a natural person to come in for respite while you take a week away. I think it's also hard because there's really no provision for taking time off for this. This is a thing I worked with Families Valued on a proposal for paid family leave, which is usually themed around childbirth. which makes sense. But we wanted to talk about, is there a way in this hypothetical world where we pass some form of paid family leave that entering hospice also triggers protected time off from work with compensation, because that's real work. That's real work that needs doing by a particular person. Even if you're relying on home health care or some institution, it takes a lot of work to coordinate it. I think a lot of folks feel like they don't have the time or a way to step back and then step back in. And then the parents feel profoundly guilty about kind of burdening their children. I think that's the last piece, which is a cultural piece. There's a big division between a subset of American families where the parents view their job as settling their kids off and then kind of never asking anything of them, right? They give, they raise them, they send them to college, and then they watch and appreciate. And other parts of American culture, including a number of immigrant cultures, where that's crazy, right? Like, kids have a filial duty to take care of their parents. And I saw this in college, where there was a huge, gap between friends of mine who came from much poorer families, where the family knew that having a kid go to Yale meant that kid was supporting the family, parents, siblings, other folks, kids who pick career paths thinking, I'm going to need to pay for my parents' retirement. And kids who came from more of my background, where we were better off in the first place, but where parents felt like they would have really hurt their child if they needed money from them later in life, rather than seeing that as the kind of flow between generations. So I think there are structural things we can do to free people up to give the care they'd like to be able to give. But there also just needs to be an acknowledgement that your parents will become needy, and that you get to love them by taking care of them or by supporting them, and that they haven't failed as parents by being human beings.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you notice, there's some of it in the new Atlantis reporting, there's examples, the Associated Press did a big story, but you get a lot of examples where it seems like there are versions of what you describe of essentially filial abandonment, but then there are versions of what you're describing where there's sort of filial detachment, right? Your children or relatives aren't as tuned in to what's going on with the older person as they should be, but they would be shocked and appalled at euthanasia. But the person themselves feels like it's, they're like, it's like, I'm doing something for my family by not asking them for help and taking, in the Canadian case, the sort of readily available alternative. And so that it's sort of a failure. Yeah, it's a failure of obligation running from below, but then there is this sort of weird dynamic of like, this is the last thing I'm supposed to do for my family, is not burden them anymore with my presence.
And in Washington State, they do surveys of the people seeking euthanasia, and it's about 75% who cite as one of their reasons, I don't want to burden others. It's only about 50% who cite pain.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about in working on this report was, I can't remember what these were called, but back in the the 30s and 40s, there used to be essentially hotels that people would live in.
SROs?
Yeah, what does that stand
Single
for?
room occupancy. You
Yeah,
don't have
basically.
a kitchen, you don't have a bathroom, you're just like a dorm, basically. You have a bedroom with amenities.
There's a kind of person, a character who came up again and again in this story that's a little hard to define, and that was the closest I could come to it was 80 years ago, this would have been somebody who was living in a single room occupancy. But now they're forced into a housing market that's a lot more expensive, that requires you to have more space than you really need. And the only way that they have to pay for that is state support. It's a kind of person who doesn't have a lot of family ties for a reason that aren't entirely clear. Maybe a lot of the family is dead, maybe they're estranged, maybe this person's mental health problems have exacerbated that. But you're always going to have this kind of collection of people in society who don't have a lot of interpersonal support. And one of the questions you face is how you go about caring for that person, what the nature of that care is, if that is just writing them a check and then when they ask for a ticket out, writing that ticket for them, or if there's another model for that. And I think a lot of what you're seeing in this reporting is that there's been a shift in the way that that society cares for those kinds of people, and that there seem to be a lot more of them than there used to be, probably because of some of the breakdown in generational ties.
Right, and just smaller. I mean, this dynamic in Japan and Western Europe and so on of, people who had one child or no children and are growing old in a context where there's so many old people. Let's take a couple more and two more. All right, let's do two more. Yes. Right, where? Yeah.
Thank you. Speaking of isolation, it's remarkable how isolated the world of physicians and nurses is unto itself. And I'm wondering where are their voices in this? What's the shift in Canada? What has their experience been like? Has anyone been studying it? And is there hope for any sort of quantitative study of the effect of, this increase in the push for euthanasia on physicians and nurses implicated in it and forced to be engaged in it?
I guess I'll speak to that as well. I don't know if there's been anything systematic. Our reporting did contain some things anecdotally on this. A lot of what the reporting consisted of was recordings of seminars that are used to train euthanasia practitioners. And one of the things that they're trained on is how to, quote, manage moral distress that arises out of the course of their work. And it was fairly obvious what that meant. They even talked explicitly about how do you handle a case where somebody is saying, I want to be euthanized basically because I'm poor or disabled, not because I'm actually terminally ill. And in the seminars, they're compassionate for not only the patients, but the providers who have to deal with this troubling situation. But they also place the emphasis on, if you can't do it yourself, you need to refer them to somebody else who can. So it sounds to me like there's not much comprehensive effort to provide that sort of support for the actual providers.
I think the encouraging thing that's kind of the complement to that is I think doctors and nurses in America also face this kind of pressure to ignore moral injury, where they're overworked, they can't care for patients the way they want to, and then their hospital will offer a wellness seminar, like remind you to drink water, there's a meditation app you can download. Please kind of put those feelings of concern for your patients away. Part of being a good doctor is managing the self-care to get over it. And in New York, the nurses walked out on strike. And they weren't striking for pay, they were striking for staffing wards so that patients could be taken care of. So that people weren't lying there, not getting turned when they needed to, developing bed sores, that when people pressed a button, someone actually came. And I see a lot of encouragement in kind of that push, especially from nurses, because they've really been strained to the breaking point, first by COVID and now by pervasive understaffing, to say, we're striking for our patients. We're getting together to say, we're not willing to provide care that isn't real care. And I think that's good training for resisting a push for euthanasia, but they're already resisting the thing that gives rise to it, which is the idea of, well, we can't meet these people's needs, so we need to do something else. And they're saying, absolutely not. Like, we want you to hire enough people to meet these people's needs. And if you're not doing that, you're not a hospital. This is your core function.
It's interesting, in a textbook on nursing bioethics I recently finished, I did some research on the Sisters of Mercy, who basically invented nursing, taught Nightingale, the whole 9 yards. One of the key pillars of careful nursing, which the Sisters invented, is self-care. And so there's a lot going back. It's deeply Catholic. It's deeply at the heart of what nursing is, to engage in self-care as part of what's going on here. I just thought I'd mention that very briefly. Also, the matching for medical students just went down last week. And once again, geriatricians horribly underrepresented in the matching numbers. And this comes at a time, in part because of the stuff we've just been talking about. And this comes at a time where I don't need to tell you, an aging population, lower resources, lack of nursing help. We're in trouble when it comes to clinical care for the elderly. And in part because we're not doing a good job of addressing moral injury and moral hazards for the clinicians who care for them.
Yeah, my impression, my grandmother is, it's in her 90s in Maine, and like that's a sort of, it's like a rural hospital system, and everything that I'm hearing from my aunts and uncles who live there, who are, she had 5 children, and it's very helpful in old age, but is just a version of that, right? That they just can't get people working in the like, she had a fall and she needed physical therapy and rehab and so on. And post-pandemic, it's just a staffing crisis, basically. All right, let's do one more question, or yes, in the back.
As y'all were talking, I kept thinking about writing that Kevin Williamson has done, first in National Review and now with the Dispatch, about the how we've kind of medicalized and sterilized the death penalty. And, if you didn't know what was going on, you could be forgiven for thinking that this guy going into this, sterile room with a guy in a white lab coat, and they clean the injection site with an alcohol pad. You know, you'd think he was getting some surgical procedure instead of a lethal cocktail of drugs. So what, if any, effect do y'all feel that the medicalization of state-sanctioned killing of those who've been sentenced to death has had on the public's view of medicalization of state-sanctioned killing of those who haven't been convicted of heinous crimes?
That's a really good question.
Why should prisoners get it and the rest of us shouldn't? Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know.
I think one central issue that your very good question raises is, how do we give an account of what healthcare is at all, right? In a world where that counts as delivering healthcare, in a world where physician-assisted killing counts as healthcare, really, we've just deconstructed the practice altogether. It's basically whatever a market or a government provides for or insists upon, and that's why I think one of the reasons I'm also not totally despondent about the situation in the United States. The American Medical Association still has not come out fully for physician-assisted killing. There's lots of people who are supportive of it, and there's a big fight regularly, year in and year out. But I think it's in part because we're still wanting to ask the question and try to give a coherent answer: what is healthcare? And that's why it's so important for Catholic healthcare institutions and the Catholic institutions of higher learning to press this and say, we have an answer to that question. We're not just going to say it's whatever the market says it is or whatever a government insists upon. And we have the example of Christ to help us answer that question.
Yeah, lethal injection it's not for the person who's being killed. It's for the rest of us to feel okay about it. If you want to kill somebody humanely, there are other ways to do it that make the rest of us feel more squeamish. I won't spell that out. And I think that precedent, it clearly has to be at play. And in fact, I think there's more to be said even about the technical similarities and legal similarities, because I believe it's basically the same drug cocktail that's being used in both cases.
Nope.
No?
Well,
propofol,
lots of the drugs that have been used for executions have been blocked from being used for executions. So
well, that's
it's
why
easier
I say
to kill someone through euthanasia than it is for lethal injection at this point.
They are very hard to obtain for lethal injections, but they are desired by the states that carry them out. So there's overlap there. So there's infrastructure overlap. I think there's also clearly some real moral overlap. And I think that the same sort of point applies. I was trying to get at this earlier, but there's a way in which euthanasia is also not for the person who's being killed. It's for the rest of us to feel like, all right, they wanted to do it and we let them, and so we've done our part. Well, that's an abdication. I think that's something that people can be brought to understand in a parallel way.
Yeah, I think the thing that's really notable about how we kill people, both in the execution chamber and in euthanasia, is that the goal is always to get people unconscious first,
right,
and then kill them. And that's certainly in the case of lethal injection meant to make sure it looks clean. It's not possible for people to articulate if they're suffering, which they have suffered, because in part we have kind of improvisational execution protocols because the drugs are hard to get, and states have to keep updating their methods or suppliers as anti-death penalty activists try and block them from using the ones they've tested before. And in euthanasia too, the first drugs are supposed to make you go to sleep and death is supposed to come afterwards. And again, that makes it hard to know what the experience is like, but it looks peaceful. There's a muscle relaxant so that no one will struggle no matter what they're feeling for everyone involved. And this is where I want to sneak in the one thing that didn't come up yet, so I'll sneak it in right now, which is, I think it's odd that our model of death that we're trying to offer to people, both in the execution chamber and in euthanasia, is one of being unconscious when we die. I think that's weird as Christians, because our goal is to make sure we're fully reconciled with God, that people have every last opportunity to make confession, to utter any last prayer. It may not be pleasant to think of dying conscious up to the last seconds, as you would be, for example, with a guillotine, which is actually one of the more humane ways, plausibly, to kill someone. Yes. It's much more reliable than our current protocols, but it's very bloody, and everyone sees that someone has died, not fallen asleep. But in a guillotine, up till that last moment, you are free to pray, free to make a last desperate act of confession of something you were ashamed to tell the priest a moment before. And I was really struck by, in the most recent issue of Plough, there's a piece by Ben Crosby, who's an Anglican priest in Canada, and really disgusted by the way his church institutionally has responded to the euthanasia regime, which includes writing prayers to say at the bedside of someone who's dying. And they're prayers, of saying like, I know, and I'm paraphrasing, you should look it up because it'll be worse than my paraphrase. I know Jesus doesn't want me to be undignified. I know Jesus doesn't want me to suffer, right? I know that Jesus wouldn't want the kind of death I would otherwise have for me. And we're in a room with a crucifix, right? We're in a room where we can see what kind of death Christ chose for himself, and that he loves us. And part of his love for us is allowing us to join any moment of suffering to him on the cross. I think what's often hard to articulate in a secular point of view is what good can suffering do? Why would you want to be aware of any part of this suffering? And I think the Anglican Church of Canada has articulated a theology of death that means Christ was a chump, right? Like he did something unnecessarily, or he did something that was only for him that actually severs him from humanity, and we're not meant to be there with him on the cross. And a challenge, across that secular divide is to say, not only do we oppose euthanasia for secular reasons, that are accessible to you and we do want you to know it, we oppose them for bigger reasons. We think there is something to be done with suffering and a reason to stay aware till the end so that you can know Christ more deeply and be with him and know him as you die and hopefully open your eyes and look upon his face.
All right. On that note, please join me in giving our panel a round of applause, and thank you all so much.